Hey there, it's Joey. Let's get EDH wrecked. That's right, it's Upping the Average, the series where we take a commander's average deck list as aggregated by the data on EDH Rec and make a couple of quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. But today, I'm giving this series a bit of a twist. The relentless pace of set releases has made this series a little bit difficult to keep up with on a per deck basis, so I would like to try it on a per set basis. Instead of just one deck, in this video, we're looking at 5. We are taking the 5 most popular commanders from Magic's most recent set, Avatar: The Last Airbender, and making swaps to improve those lists for your next game night. That means we're covering Fire Lord Azula with nearly 11,000 decks, Toph the First Metalbender with 10,000, Avatar Aang who's on his way to 6,000, Iroh Grand Lotus with 4,000 decks, and Fire Lord Zuko also with 4,000. All deck lists will of course be linked down in the description below, and as a reminder, our rule in this series is that in total, whenever making swaps to a deck, the swaps must either keep the price of that deck cost neutral or else help to lower the total price of that list. Can't just cut a bunch of 25-cent cards and then add in a bunch of things that cost $10. We gotta respect the budget. We have a lot to cover here, so let's get started. Our first commander is Fire Lord Azula, who is busted. Of all the commanders who can firebend that will appear in this video, this is the one that will care the most about actually using that firebending mana. Whenever we cast a spell while Fire Lord Azula is an attacker, that spell gets copied. And with firebending 2, she gives us 2 extra mana to use during that combat. Magecraft cards work particularly well in this deck, as both the casting and copying of the spell will trigger it, so a card like Archmage Emeritus is able to draw a ton of cards. Since we're copying spells, why not take advantage and also play Twinning Staff while we're at it, to copy things again? Simple spells become simply insane value here. When we cast Unexpected Windfall, we will copy it without having to pay the additional cost, so we will discard 1 card to draw 4 cards and make 4 treasures. I think we might also need to make Atali an honorary member of the Fire Nation too, because when Atali attacks and we get the top card from everybody's library, any spell that we decide to cast from among those is also going to be copied. So we could get 8 spells for free with 1 attack. And if someone ever makes the poor mistake of choosing not to block Azula, we can double her power, which will be doubled again. Absolutely wild. The sheer number of powerful spells that we can sling during our combat phase makes this deck simply absurd. With all that heat comes some serious levels of both explosion and control, as even our removal spells will get doubled up. I think this deck is still technically in bracket 3, what with having 3 game changers and a pretty spicy game plan, but it would not take that much to push this into bracket 4 territory. And when deciding where you're going to play this deck, I would endeavor to make sure that it is aiming upward when finding a pod rather than punching down. When it comes to upgrades for this deck, we need to remember that it's not just instants that will get copied by Azula. Don't forget that we can also copy permanent spells when they're cast during combat to help build up our board state or to double up on enter the battlefield effects. So, upgrades. Torrential Gearhulk is a star-studded gem for this deck, as the creature itself will get copied during combat, which means that we can flashback 2 different spells from our graveyard, which will also become copied. This means we will get 4 spells and 2 5/6 bodies in play for just 6 mana. Now that's an upgrade. Mysterious Stranger slots into the deck for exactly the same reason. It needs a slightly fuller graveyard, and the results are a lot more random, but even then, the value is just undeniable. I also adore Mocking Doppelganger here, which will get copied when cast during combat to then mimic 2 enemy creatures and to goad them to make sure that the best stuff in play stays off our back. Azula has 4 power and draws a lot of attention to herself, so I'm also going to add in Stubborn Denial and Bolt Bend, an ability she doesn't know in the actual show, but which is vital for her to learn here in EDH. Also, I want to put in a Winged Boots to help ward her and to make her harder to block so that she can attack a lot more freely. Speaking of which, Leap and Shadow Rift become 1 mana, draw 2 cards, and make Azula hard, if not impossible, to block. Attack, cast these during the Declare Attacker step before blockers can even be declared, and then get to business with all of your other spells. Oh, and speaking of great card draw, Sazakap's Brew is basically another version of the Thrill of Possibility spells that we're already playing in this list, though it also has potential upside if we're ever in the mood to give a gift, so that's pretty rad. I do not mind paying 2 mana and discarding 1 card to draw 4 cards while also having the option to buff up my commander twice. That sounds superb. My next addition is Grima, but to understand why, we need a quick reminder about how combat works. The combat phase is divided into 5 different steps. The beginning of combat, the Declare Attacker step, the Declare Blocker step, the Combat Damage step, and the end of combat. Once Azula is declared an attacker, she is considered an attacker until the entire end of the combat phase. This means that we can deal combat damage, and for a brief moment before the next main phase, she will still be considered an attacking creature, which will copy our spells even during the end of combat. Thus, Grima unblockably attacking alongside Azula will connect and steal an instant or sorcery from our opponent, which he will then cast, technically during the combat phase while Azula is an attacking creature, for free, and which we will then copy for free as well. I don't know what spell we're going to get, but you can't beat free. The only thing that feels better than free is when free gets copied. Then we have Go-Go, Mysterious Mimic, and Comet Storm. Comet Storm is an instant that can use all of our firebending and ritualistic mana if we end up getting a whole bunch of it, and I prefer this card to some of the sorceries that currently exist in the list, since this is more naturally ready to be copied by our commander to double up all of our damage. More on the sorceries in a moment. Meanwhile, Go-Go is pretty dang funny. If we're setting up for Azula to arrive onto the scene, Go-Go will be able to copy her and give her haste, which now means that when they both attack, we're now tripling our spells, and that is just plain disgusting value. So disgusting and so much value that frankly Azula would judge us if we didn't do it. Rounding things out with the mana resources, I'm completing the cycle of signets that are already in the deck by including the one that isn't yet here, Rakdos Signet. We're also going to add in a Rogue's Passage to help keep our attacking commander safe in case of emergency, and this little red arena will help give Azula haste if we need it in a pinch. This brings our total land count up to 38, which makes our opening hands feel a lot better. I'm also going to change out 3 basic lands in exchange for the cards Path of Ancestry and the 2 Pain lands that aren't already yet in the deck, so that the cycles are all finished in the mana base, just to make things clean and simple. But with that, now we must move to the cuts. The cuts for this deck will first appear to be kind of strange, but I'm going to echo the same sentiments as Commander Mechanic, who has a great video about Azula as well. He and I have both come to the same conclusion here. The flash enablers in this deck are kind of a trap. I'm cutting Orrery, Leyline of Anticipation, Valley Floodcaller, Born Upon a Wind, and High Fae Trickster. So yes, these do give everything flash, which would then let Azula copy things that she couldn't normally copy. Sorceries and creatures and things like that. The thing is, that is an entire extra step, an entire extra card, an entire extra play, and I would just rather that the stuff in the deck just already actually has flash or is already instant speed, dang it. That extra step of setup is meaningful in a deck that intends to operate this efficiently and this quickly. These cards have a really cool synergy, but it bends the requirements of the rest of the deck in a way that I just feel is unnecessary, like putting a haste granter into a deck where all of the creatures already have haste. Any sorcery that we want to copy now requires these cards to be in play to become effective. So if we only draw A or B, but not A plus B, then our deck is just stumbling over itself. We can save a ton of time and a ton of money by just copying things that are already instant speed, which are already really damn good spells. Okay, next, Azula's ditching the family. Ozai the Phoenix King, as well as Aisling and Electro, want to keep our mana, whereas Azula wants to spend it. Father and daughter are just kind of at odds here. The same goes for the brother. Zuko, Firebending Master, is just too slow for her, and Firebending Student is just trying to do a lot of firebending stuff that Azula ultimately will not end up needing. Firebending Ascension is pretty cute, but let's be honest, Azula has a target on her back. We're probably not going to have her in play long enough to get counters on this thing anyway. These cards all just really slow her down. Mana Geyser is a really good card, but it does have a timing restriction here that can make getting the most out of these cards a bit more challenging. In a traditional Spellslinger deck, this card's amazing, but this is a Firelord Azula deck, which plays a bunch of instant tricks. We want to focus on the commander, not the archetype. Speaking of which, also, the last Agni Kai is a very evocative card. Like, this is an image I can hear, one of my favorite animated moments in all of media, but it is not exactly the kind of card that Azula wants to copy a lot, since Azula will be our main creature, and fighting twice in one turn with the spell getting copied is kind of a tall order. I think it's best if Azula escapes these expectations and goes her own way. Sozin's Comet will make less mana than our instant speed rituals, kind of a shame, but as we'll also see with Firelord Zuko later on in this video, the Comet is much more of an Ozai card than a Zuko or Azula card. Crackle with Power is a really good sorcery, and it was in the deck to become an instant speed card with the flash enablers, but, well, we cut those because Crackle with Power on its own just isn't enough reason to take up that many card slots in the deck. It's a very solid X-Spell, but since it is sorcery speed, I would rather have the Comet Storm, since that one is more useful to us in more situations that organically come up during combat as we're just playing this deck naturally. With all those swaps, we arrive at this final result, a deck whose instant speed tricks are all happening on our own turn, and yet which will still manage to be absolutely devastating. That really describes Azula for you. You know what's coming, and yet she leaves you powerless to stop it, which only makes her all the more terrifying. The deck list can be found in the description box below, with the cuts in the maybe board. Before we get back to the decks, here's a quick word from our sponsors. This video is sponsored by Commander Rules Deck. Listen, Commander is the greatest game in the world, but it's also complicated. Every playgroup has common questions. The steps of combat, or layers, or how priority works, or what protection means. Rules Deck is a quick reference deck of rules cards that will help you immediately, easily reduce all confusion around weird rules edge cases and avoid any disputes about how things are supposed to work. It's designed like premium TCG cards, portable and intuitive, and they save you a lot of time having to look up forums or Reddit posts or the sheer block of text that is the comprehensive rulebook, or all of those things that can slow down or break up the flow of Commander games so that you can just get right back to the fun. Check them out at the link in the description. Get Rules Deck to upgrade your game night. This show is also sponsored by Dragon Shield, makers of the finest, toughest, best sleeves on the market, and they were so confident in the quality of their sleeves that they sent a sleeved card to space and back. They even have a phenomenal card scanning app that will help you catalog your collection too. It's super fast and super accurate. And you can make custom sleeves with Dragon Shield as well. I recommend checking out our EDH Rec sleeves personally. And if you order from Dragon Shield at the link in the description, make sure that you use code EDHREC in all lowercase for a discount, whether you're getting custom sleeves, EDH Rec sleeves, or their Fetchland sleeves with officially licensed magic art, or dang, there are so many good options. In fact, mark your calendars. The Landfall series dual matte sleeves with gorgeous official Fetchland artwork goes on sale starting on December 12th, so don't miss out. Again, that's Dragon Shield, linked below, code EDHREC, all lowercase, for a discount on your order, and thanks so much to Dragon Shield for sponsoring the show. Up next in our list of 5 is the most expensive of the decks and one of the most interesting commanders of the set. Toph, the first Metalbender, is a 3/3 Naya human warrior ally for 4 mana, and when she's in play, all our non-token artifacts will become lands in addition to their other types. That doesn't make them tap for mana naturally, but don't worry, we'll have a solution for that. We also get to Earthbend 2 on our end step, which animates the target and will return it to the field tapped if it dies or gets exiled. That last part, the Earthbent target coming back into play, is huge for the tricky synergy of this deck. Earthbending a fetch land, which then will plop back onto the field, is great value, and it's really great for landfall triggers, but there's so much more we can do. Earthbending an Esper Sentinel to guarantee it will draw us cards and that it will stick around longer is simply inspired. But the real gold is when we earthbend those artifacts, which are now lands, so that we can reuse their abilities. Let's crack a Stasis Coffin over and over and over and over to perpetually have protection from everything. Or maybe we just want to constantly snoop on our opponents with a reusable Mishra's Bauble, which will also draw us extra cards. This deck also contains a Mindslaver, so yes, we can take one person's turns forever and ever. Notably, Toph turns our metal into lands, but doesn't give them a land type, so they don't yet tap for mana on their own, but that's why cards like Yavimaya, Chromatic Lantern, Dryadly Legion Grove, and tons of others will grant them mana abilities so that they can join us in resource production. Terra Eternal now makes all of our lands and our artifacts indestructible. That's wild. And yes, it must be remarked, destroying all non-land permanents feels pretty darn one-sided when Toph lets your artifacts all dodge your board wipe. I ran this average deck list through the Commander Spellbook website and discovered that the list contains 16 different combos, mostly surrounding cards like Zurin Orb and Ashaya. Ashaya with Boomy Unleashed, for instance, could produce infinite combats, since Boomy himself becomes a land that he will then give extra combats to. Or if those are all in play, Boomy is a land and can earthbend himself, which then means that Zurin Orb can sacrifice him, gaining 2 life, and then he will come back into play from the earthbending return ability, at which point he will earthbend himself again, lather, rinse, repeat for infinite landfall, infinite land sack, and infinite life. That all probably sounds very intimidating, and don't get me wrong, those combos are intimidating, but I do want to clarify that most of the combos in this deck require 3 cards, not 2 cards. Now, Ashaya plus Boomy is definitely an exception to that. That is a 2-card combo that will get infinite combats and probably win the game. But the point is, there are still prerequisites, and even the other combos that are technically 2-card combos, Toph with Mindslaver or Toph with Stasis Coffin for instance, either require a decent chunk of setup time, or are protecting you but are still technically disruptible when people muck with your board. This deck is extraordinary at finding amazing value engines, but I don't think the presence of combos like these in the deck means that this is streamlined a definite always going to combo type of deck. Rather, I think it just makes it an exceptionally powerful deck. Point is, this deck is definitely in bracket 3, and it's like kind of poking its head into bracket 4 on occasion. I do think it is more firmly planted in the bracket 3 space, but it's aiming upwards. It's aiming pretty darn high. I think for a more official bracket 4 space diagnosis, I would expect to see like more tutors and stuff like that. This current list is still demonstrating a lot of interest in the general earthbending and general landfall and value plays that we characterize with the bracket 3 spaces. But regardless, just note that this list is strong, and it contains some endgame plans that probably warrant a proper heads up to the rest of the table before you commence with gameplay. If you want to avoid playing combos in this deck and you want to try powering Toph down to the bracket 2 space, then in addition to losing any game changers that are in the list, I recommend ditching the Coffin, the Mindslaver, and Ashaya, and paying careful attention to Zern Orb and Sylvan Safekeeper too. Those cards are the biggest culprits when it comes to combo. But we're here to upgrade this list. How will we do it? First, 2 hilarious pieces for Toph. All Fate's Scroll and Survey Mechan have abilities for each differently named land we control, which now also includes our artifacts. They'll draw a bazillion cards for us, and they will do so on repeat if we Metalbend them to let them return. Hilarious, glorious value, gotta have them. However, I am going to take out the Cycle of Renewal that's in the deck and cut that one in exchange for a land searcher that I just think is better, and that's Entish Restoration. It's the same effect, 3 mana, sack a land, get some more, but this one has the possibility to get 3 lands instead of just 2. And as long as I'm talking about cuts, real quick, I'm losing Hardened Scales and Ozolith the Shattered Spire. I like these cards plenty fine, just not here. This deck does put counters places, but dividing our attention between +1 counters and lands and artifacts is not a recipe for success. This deck is getting value, potentially bonkers land warping value, while also repeating amazing effects off of amazing artifacts, which means that the +1 counters are just not our focus here. We're still playing the Earth Crystal, that one has other uses in this deck too, so I think that we'll be fine without these. I also, though, think that Toph has an enormous target on herself, so I would like a little more protection for her, but I'm going to prioritize some diverse protection pieces that could also have an offensive flair. Collective Resistance either saves our girl or destroys something that we care about, or both, and Liquimetal Coating is joining the Liquimetal Torque that is already in the deck. Yes, it can turn other stuff opponents control into metal so that we can destroy them more easily, which is always great, but with Toph, this card is simply fantastic. Turning her into metal, so then she's also a land, and then she can earthbend herself, which means that if she dies or gets exiled, she will come right back into play. This is like a repeatable Kaya's Ghost form for our commander, and good luck ever dealing with her when this is in play. This synergy is wild. To hint at something else that's coming up, I'm actually also going to add in a land that will help protect Toph too, but I'll get to the mana base in just a moment. To make room for all the stuff we want to throw in, I'm going to be cutting some of the more generic Earthbender cards. The Boulder is conflicted, but he doesn't belong here, the Badgermole, and the one-time spells of Earthbending Lesson and Earth Rumble. Why am I cutting these? Because they're only alright. They're one-off or a lot of mana or both. Don't worry, we still have 14 other cards in the deck that can Earthbend and which have better payoffs when they do. If you really want a lot more Earthbending to happen in this deck, I'd personally be a lot more inclined to add in more cards like the Annie Joins Up that is already in the list to help Toph double her earthbending triggers. I think that would have a much higher yield for us than these earthbending spells do. Okay, now let's upgrade the most important part of the deck, the lands. I've cut more cards from the 99 than I've added, and that is because I want to make room for more cool mana stuff and to make sure that we're hitting our land drops consistently. A low starting land count is kind of going to be a pattern for all the decks we're upgrading today. Anyway, Kessig Wolfrun is a personal favorite as a just-in-case type of finisher, but Rift Portal is especially grand. If this one ends up in the yard, it gives our lands a mana ability, which then accomplishes the task of helping our artifacts to now actually tap for mana. Very underrated card for Toph decks. However, the most important swap arounds are these. I'm exchanging these 2 lands, which are either tapped or part of an incomplete cycle in this deck, and 2 basics for a bunch of the modal double-faced land cards. Onto Inversion is another spell that we can abuse when all of our artifacts will dodge it. It's a big mana cost, kind of a tall order for an emergency button, but it's still a decent ripcord if we have to pull it. But the best ones are definitely the creatures. If these were played as lands and then they get earthbent and then they die, the earthbending effects will send them back to the field on their front half. We'll get their Enter the Battlefield effect to destroy stuff, retrieve important spells, or, for the Disciple of Frey at least, to draw a bunch of cards. These swap-arounds, plus the lands that we just added earlier, still keep us at 37 available mana sources, which is fine for a deck that cares this much not just about lands, but also about artifacts, and which has so many other ways to make those artifacts produce mana. And we truly do have plans to play each of these as lands pretty often because of that really cool synergy that we could activate later on in the game. Each of these cards is just brilliant in this deck, far too brilliant for us to pass up. Finally, here's a tough Toph swap, but Inventor's Fair and Talon Gates of Vidara are both 10 to 12 bucks right now, and I would prefer that this slot and this amount of the budget go to the Talon Gates instead. I'm going to add that one in by replacing it with the Inventor's Fair from the original list, because just holy crap, Talon Gates is so insane in lands decks and in earthbending decks especially. Like, the effect is already good on its own. Phase something out to either make a creature unable to block you or to protect a creature of our own, but when you earthbend this thing, with all the sacrifice at instant speed that this deck can do, it can come back and then protect a creature again, fade another removal spell or phase out a huge oncoming attacker. This deck contains a crop rotation. We want this target in our deck for a crop rotation to be able to find. It will make you feel all powerful when that line of play is available to you. I really think this card should take the spot instead. It's frankly wild that Talon Gates doesn't even show up on Toph's page. By the way, for some quick honorable mentions, Roaming Throne seems wild in this deck, doubling Toph's triggers, and she'll immediately protect it by earthbending it. Urborg, Tomb of Yawgmoth is technically allowable even in this deck since it doesn't have a black mana symbol on it, and this will serve the same function as a Yavimaya to help our artifacts be able to tap for mana. And Gonti's Aether Heart can be used to chain extra turns if you're playing enough artifacts, and the earthbending effect will bring it back from the exile. Since that is chaining extra turns together, that feels a lot more appropriate for the bracket 4 space than bracket 3, so I avoided it here, but if you are upgrading and don't mind splurging on this deck, each of these seems like another great space to look into. That will do it for this deck. Behold, she is Melon Lord. Truth be told, I think that as Toph decks get upgraded into the brackets 4 and 5 spaces, they'll lean way harder into the artifact territory than the lands territory, so keep your eye out for that for any other further upgrades. And as before, links for the decks are in the description below, and of course, let me know your favorite tech for this deck too. Just a quick interlude, if you're enjoying the video so far, please consider doing the YouTube algorithm thingies, the likies, the clickies, the subscribies, all that stuff. It really helps the channel out a lot. And if you're also in the mood for extra gifts during the holidays this year, consider treating yourself to our Patreon. We have some amazing perks over there, including some exclusive content. Please have a fantastic holiday season, and let's get back into the video with our next Avatar Commander, Avatar Aang. It wouldn't be a proper list of Avatar: The Last Airbender commanders without the Avatar himself, right? As anyone who has seen Avatar: The Last Airbender would expect, Aang is all about bending the 4 elements. Every time that we use a firebending, waterbending, earthbending, or airbending ability, we get to draw a card. Aang comes with his own firebending on the card itself, so we are guaranteed to be able to draw at least 1 card per turn as long as Aang can attack, and if we are able to do all 4 in the same turn, he will flip over to Aang, Master of Elements. On this side, Aang is now a 6/6 flying creature that says spells you cast cost Wooburg less to cast. And note, this reduction will also reduce generic costs too, so a whole lot of our spells will get super cheap, if not free. We'll frankly basically be able to empty our hand if we flip to this side, and when we run out of cards to play, on any upkeep we can transform Aang back to his original side, getting 4+1 counters, drawing 4 cards, dealing 4 damage to each opponent, and gaining 4 life in the process. That's kinda nutty, which makes sense, because Aang is really hard to flip over in the first place. Frankly, it's not going to be reasonable for us to expect that we will flip Aang to the back half in every game. Instead, consider it more of an achievement unlocked type of item. Now, there are a few key cards to point out in this deck. Katara doubling ally triggers means that we will firebend twice on attack, which also means doubling both of Aang's draw triggers when he sees the firebending, so that's delicious. And Toph Hard-Headed Teacher means that we will draw a card every time we cast a spell. Note too how much ally synergy this deck contains. Nearly every single creature in the deck is an ally, so we can also lean into that to get some extra cool synergies there too. Now, this deck stands out from all the others in this video for a very important reason. In just glancing over the average deck list, it becomes immediately apparent that this average deck is an all-Avatar set theme deck. Even the few cards that might look typical at first actually have other Avatar reskinnings once you go digging through their available printings. In total, there are only 4 non-land cards in the deck that do not reflect Avatar in any version of their art, and most of those cards are not even ranking very highly in the popularity of Aang decks according to the EDH rec data. That puts things in a slightly weird spot for us. My goal with this series is to help players upgrade their decks in such a way that it makes their deck run more smoothly, and I've traditionally found that I'm always going to be willing to cut cute flavor cards in favor of other cards that will help make a deck feel a little bit more buttoned up. I believe that approach is helpful to players and serves as a useful learning tool, and overall just helps a deck perform more consistently so that players can enjoy that deck in the first place. However, in this deck, I believe that taking my usual approach would be a disservice. Though I'm sure there are plenty of players who want to build Avatar Aang in a more optimized or practical way, the goal of this series is to assist the average player and help make their deck a little more capable and a little more enjoyable. And clearly, what players are enjoying with this commander is to abide by this theme. Adding in a Haribaz Druid or a Hero's Podium would probably make this deck a lot better, but those don't seem to be the kinds of suggestions that those players are looking for in this instance. In which case, suggesting adding in those cards would mean that I'm not really upping the average. So for this deck's upgrades, I will follow what I believe are the intentions of the average builder of an Avatar Aang deck and upgrade using only Avatar-specific cards. I think that will still be fun and will still be an opportunity for a couple of upgrades even within those limitations that will make this deck a little more buttoned up and a little bit more enjoyable to play. And to be honest, this restriction doesn't even hamstring us all that much because this set is where all of the bending abilities are, so that's how Aang is going to draw us the most cards anyway. There is one prominent exception to this, however, and that's the card Moon Mist in the average deck. This is supposed to be a werewolves card, but it transforms all humans, and that immediately flips Aang over. Automatically entering the Avatar state is just so dang good. I'll discuss theme and some other asterisks or exceptions a little bit later on, but for now, I want to clarify here that I simply love this extremely unique synergy so much, and even if this card does not abide by the flavor, I just can't cut a card from this deck that brings this big of a smile to my face. Now let's get to business. Here's a quick rundown of how much of each type of bending we have in the deck. There are currently 11 possible water bending outlets, 7 for fire bending, 12 that could earth bend, and 11 that can air bend. Since Aang himself already has fire bending, that smaller number on fire bending actually isn't that bad at all. And also, for reasons I'll get into later, some of the bending cards are a lot tougher to actually use the bending on than it may seem at first. So even though these numbers do help us get our bearings, do not take each of these numbers for granted. So, upgrades. First, let's make sure that the essentials are still intact. Chromatic Lantern, Farseek, and Swords to Plowshares are the 3 remaining non-theme spells in the deck. And to be honest, as flavor breaks go, they're pretty low-key cards that I would still personally feel pretty fine seeing in a theme deck. But if you're going to commit, then I'm going to exchange those for cards that will fulfill the same roles. The Earth King will ramp us lands when we attack with creatures that have 4+ power, which our commander does. Plus, it gives us a big bear token to help out with that too. Animal Attendant isn't as good as Farseek, but it is on theme, even if it's very rarely ever going to give a thing a +1 counter. And Swords to Plowshares, as removal goes, feels like it's telling the story of a war-hardened character learning to instead appreciate the value of good, honest work. That one just makes me smile. It fits our flavor in 2 different ways. By making these lateral swaps, hopefully each of these will keep up our ratios of the necessary deck categories so that our deck can still hang and is still eating its vegetables, so to speak. To be honest though, I was not satisfied with this deck's removal output as it was, so I'm putting in some reskinned cards. Imprison in the Moon, sorry Yue, sorry Sokka, that's rough buddy, and Blasphemous Act to give us another board wipe. This deck's a little janky, so we gotta get some emergency button cards up in here. We don't want our opponents to be able to run us over. On the note of overcoming obstacles though, I'd also really like to get in a Bolt Bend. Our commander is powerful enough to make this just 1 mana, and I think once people see Aang draw so many cards, they're gonna chase after him just as viciously as Zuko did. The Earth King's Lieutenant, I think, isn't terrible here since so many of the creatures are allies, but I think this deck would prefer a more proper pump, and the reskinned Beastmaster Ascension, I just think kind of pulls off this job a lot better. This in the deck feels like a proper finisher. Also, I like most of the Saga cards here, but not the Legend of Korok. The other sagas offer unique abilities to both draw cards and eventually assist with consistent bending outlets on their back halves, but this blue saga draws cards on the front, but on the back half, the water bending effect requires so much mana. I just don't think we're set up to take advantage of the saga like we are all of the others. I recognize this could be a card that people keep for flavor, but I just think we have a lot of other, more consistent water bending in the deck already, and that the value this one offers underperforms compared to the other sagas and in terms of what will make the deck actually hum. Speaking of inconsistent bending, I'm also cutting Zuko and Katara, the master bending versions. Zuko needs us to cast instants during combat, and Katara needs us to cast them on other people's turns. We're not equipped to gain enough experience with them, and Zuko's firebending doesn't even work at all unless we have any experience to begin with, and Katara doesn't even bend. Don't get me wrong, I have seen these cards go off in a dedicated experience counters deck. Shout out to my buddy Ashton. But here, in this deck, we are not dedicated to that stuff in a way that will make these cards shine. This is why I said we shouldn't take the bending numbers for granted. Just because this Zuko or the flipped Kuruk could bend doesn't mean they always will. So they were kind of artificially inflating the numbers that we saw earlier. Bonus perk, cutting these saves a lot of money on the budget for this deck too. I mean, that's not the reason that I'm cutting them. I do think that they are better served in other decks, but still, it's a nice cherry on top. Don't feel like you must go out of your way to get these cards for this deck. And, okay, it turns out I am not done with exiling Zuko just yet. Call me Fire Lord Ozai, I guess, because I'm cutting the other two versions of Zuko in the deck too. I'm sorry, Zuko, I love you, but okay, hear me out. This is why I'm doing it. I don't think this deck needs to run any black mana. These two cards here are the only cards in the deck with a black mana pip. Our commander costs white, blue, black, red. There is no room for generic mana there. It costs the other 4 colors to cast. It never even needs to interact with black mana. So in an early turn, a simple swamp could make us stumble and not able to cast our spells. Like, pay attention to how low the mana curve is in this deck, which means that the spells are often very cheap, and that places a lot more emphasis on their mana pips. I think we cut the swamps and cut these 2 cards to help center our focus, so that we do not stumble on color fixing. Arguably, you don't actually even need to have swamps in the deck to cast these cards, since there are going to be other ways of producing black mana here and there, but I would really just rather make things clean and simple so that we can enjoy what this deck is trying to accomplish. If you do want to keep one of these though, Mayan Zuko is pretty darn good. I definitely respect it. Now, you may have noticed that I cut more cards than I added, and that is because I'm adding in extra lands in this deck to bring the land count up to 38. We gotta hit our land drops, and this deck has a lot of colors, so we need options. So I've cut a bunch of cards, including the swamps from the mana base, so what am I adding? Well, I'll start with a simple one, the reskin of Fabled Passage. On theme, and it color fixes. Cool. The next 3, though, will need a bit more explanation. These 3 ally-specific lands. Now, these cards are obviously not on theme, so why am I adding them? Well, it's because this mana base isn't on theme. To my eye, this mana base is a little bit of a mishmash. I mean, all 6 non-black shock lands are in here, and most players seem to care more that the actual castable cards fit the theme, while the mana base just needs to be there to help the deck work in the first place. So that is why I think it's okay to run some off-theme cards that will help cast all but like one of the creature cards in our deck. Now, if we went too far into that reasoning and used that as an excuse to start throwing in like all the fetches and all the channel lands or whatever, that would probably break the immersion, but I don't think that these cross the line that the current mana base has already drawn. Also, I'm sorry, but Reliquary Tower is getting in the way a little bit too. To be honest, I'm even dubious about all of the other colorless lands in this deck, Rumble Arena and Secret Tunnel and stuff like that, but I'm going to give those ones time to prove themselves. Tower, though, it's a bit weird here. As a colorless land, it doesn't tend to disrupt things too much in a 1 or 2 or 3 color deck, but here, the colorless pip does stop us from casting Aang on time. And I do think that the times that this could stop us from casting our commander or casting our other spells are going to be a lot more annoying than the times that we have to discard from like 9 cards to our best 7 cards instead. I'm going to exchange this and a basic land or 2 for the traditional budget fetch lands to just make sure that this deck gets its colors. No, again, they're not technically on theme, but I think they're very inoffensive. As before, the mana base is simply here to be functional and fairly invisible so that the rest of the deck can do the work of highlighting the amazing theme. And that will do it. An all-avatar flavor deck, with an exception for a fairly basic mana base and a single moon mist that will help the avatar uniquely transform. If you have a different take on what types of exceptions should or should not be allowed in a theme deck, let me know in the comments. For now, though, I think it's time for us to get to the next commander, the 4th most popular one, and everyone's favorite uncle, Iroh Grand Lotus. Like any good mentor figure, Iroh is all about imparting life lessons, or more specifically, lesson cards. These instants and sorceries tend to provide some generic value, like token making, removal, card draw, ramp, the types of things that you would expect to see in any commander deck, just at a slightly less optimal speed or mana value than usual. Iroh doesn't care about that though, as we're able to recast those lessons from our graveyard for just 1 mana. This deck also plays its share of cost reducers, so it isn't uncommon to see these spells cast for completely free. This deck is not just limited to lessons though, because on our turn our other instants and sorceries in the graveyard gain flashback equal to their mana costs too. Just recasting a mana Morphos can be great value, but casting something like a Secrets of Bloodbending to control a player's combat or whole turn more than just one time can flat out end a game with style. It's interesting seeing a commander take advantage of lesson cards from this set and from the Strixhaven set. Traditionally, we haven't had a use for those types of cards just yet, so it's nice to see them slot right into the spellslinging archetype at long last. This deck is also balling on a budget. The average deck for Iroh is by far the cheapest of any of the commander decks in this video, barely $100, so we can go very easy on the wallet while going all in against our foes. Iroh is the type of commander who will take a few turns to set everything up and then rattle off a flurry of spells to have one of the most explosive turns under the sun. If your graveyard is big enough and you have a cost reducer in play, Iroh's arrival on the battlefield could mean that he casts 5 or 7 or a dozen lessons for free. Chaining those cards together with something like a Rite of the Dragoncaller or a Gutter Snipe or a 1,000-Year Storm in play is going to let Iroh just storm off with the best of them. If done right, this is practically a Mizzix's Mastery in the command zone. When we look for cards to add to our deck, we want to make sure we're going for stuff that will help us with that one big turn while also keeping the spirit of the lessons alive. As far as upgrades for this deck go, I wanted to do 3 things. First, I wanted to increase our land total up from where it is now so that we can actually ensure that we hit our land drops. Our commander costs 6 mana. We cannot hit a 6 mana commander if we don't have enough lands. Why are all of the land counts in the decks in this video so low? Come on, people, you gotta play more lands. Second, I also wanted to add in some more payoffs for casting instants and sorceries to help us out on those potentially stormy turns. And finally, I also wanted to smooth over the deck by improving some of the ramp and the card draw and even some of the recursion spells in this deck. Basically, I wanted to make sure that our deck is eating our veggies. That seems like the most important lesson of all. The 4 lands we're adding have a spell attached to them, so that we'll have the option to cast them with Iroh if our hand floods out with land. Pinnacle Monk gets back an instant or sorcery from the graveyard, but also leaves behind a 2/2 body with prowess. Salonde Vision gets our best instant and sorcery from our top 6, while Balligad Recovery, classic, gets something back from our graveyard for us to use again. Rounding off our lands is Lindblom Industrial Regency. Casting the Adventure Mage Siege half to get a 1/1 Black Wizard token that deals 1 damage to each opponent when we cast our non-creature spells is gonna put in a nice amount of work. This is a land that comes with a free mini Gutter Snipe. While I'm in the land section, I'm also going to swap out 4 basic lands for these. Bounce lands are a personal favorite of mine, especially if we have more lands with spells attached to them in the deck now, but also even if we do end up having to discard to hand size, I don't think this deck cares that much. We're playing around with the graveyard. And then Path of Ancestry we're getting in here because it's a 3-color budget tapped land that occasionally will let us scry. Just feels pretty good. This deck's ramp is looking a smidgen thin to me, so I'm just popping in 2 classics here, Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. The fact that these are sorceries will trigger our Magecraft, which will come up again in a moment. Also, we need a proper board wipe in this list, so I'm getting Blasphemous Act in here, please and thank you. And now, let's get in the big guns. I'm throwing in Coruscation Mage, Caldera Pyramaw, Shadow of the Goblin, and Fiery Inscription. When we cast Iroh, we want the impact to be huge. But the average deck's original loadout of Magecraft payoffs was just way too tiny. Coruscation Mage gives 2 bodies to deal damage as we cast our stuff, Fiery Inscription will deal damage and it isn't going to die to incidental creature wipes, the Pyramaw does increasingly more and more and more damage, this is the perfect deck for this card, and Shadow of the Goblin is kind of a sleeper hit for me. That discard and draw effect helps us filter through to get the setup stuff that we need before Iroh arrives on the field, and then all the damage that it will do when we start chaining through our graveyard is absolutely nutty. Alright, to add things, we must cut. So what needs to leave to make space for all the exciting stuff we just put in? Aang's Journey, Firebending Lesson, and the utterly devastating Leaves from the Vine are all going. For the 2 lesson spells, even with them being lessons, they just really aren't going to move the needle very much for us. We still have 25 other lessons, we'll be okay without these. And Leaves from the Vine, while a terrific moment of flavor, just isn't pulling its weight in this particular deck. We care about instants and sorceries in this deck, and this design is terrific, but it doesn't enhance this strategy mechanically. Also, I don't want to ugly cry every time I play this deck, so please let's cut this one. To be honest, the reason that Leaves from the Vine gets cut are only exaggerated with these next 3. The Lion Turtle, Dragonfly Swarm, and, yes, Gran. The irony of these cards is that they actually start to work against the strategy eventually. If the plan is to get a cost reducer and some Magecraft triggers and then play Iroh and unleash all those spells again, I mean, hopefully that will be a lethal turn, but that's not a guarantee. And more importantly, our graveyard will be empty, which means that these cards lose their edge. Gran can be a cost reducer, but the 3-card threat threshold is a bummer. Lion Turtle is still a mana dork, which is fine, but I'd rather be casting an instant or sorcery to trigger our Magecraft effects instead, so that's why I made the swap for the ramp spells earlier. Firebending Student, Electro, and Ran and Shaw feel to me like they rely a little bit too much on the firebending side of things. And yes, Iroh does have firebending, but it's very incidental and is not the main focus of our deck here. Ran and Shaw, I almost want to keep. I could kind of justify it, but even if we do get their payoff, it's just not as huge a payoff compared to all of our other Magecraft triggers in the deck. So trying to split our attention between those things seems like more often than not, it will make us stumble, unfortunately. Finally, Master Paku and Guru Patik are the hardest cut. The Guru, I just feel, ends up being too much mana to occasionally get a couple of counters, and his digging effect feels more important for shrines than for lessons. And as for Paku, I actually like the idea of him milling us to load up the graveyard, but it's hard to get in a safe attack with him, to get him tapped to use this effect, which was also the case for Grand, so that's why I feel those cards just aren't as consistent. Truth be told, for further upgrades in this deck, adding in a bunch more looting cards that will draw and discard so that you can shape your hand and shape your graveyard more efficiently, I think that would end up greasing the wheels of this deck, so look for those for further upgrades. And that is Iroh, Grand Lotus. May he teach you and your opponents many a lesson. After all, it's important to draw wisdom from many places. If we take it from only one place, it becomes rigid and stale. And Iroh would not be down with stale tea. The deck is down in the description box below, and that leaves us with just one more commander left. And who else could it be but Iroh's dear nephew, Fire Lord Zuko? Hey, Zuko here. This is a surprisingly diverse commander with many potential pathways to brew. Firelord Zuko has Firebending X, where X is his power. Zuko's base stats start off as a 2/4, but these stats can get a lot bigger, as every time that we cast a spell from exile or a permanent enters play from exile, we can put a +1 counter on each creature we control. Not just on Zuko, each creature we control. Zuko working off of stuff coming back from exile is easily one of my favorite pieces of design from this entire set. A+ work. This set of abilities is pretty wide open as far as how Zuko wants to be built. You can play Zuko as a Blink commander, or Cascade, or just a regular play from exile commander, a la Prosper Tomebound. And there's also potential in the firebending mana that we get from attacks. Plus, this deck really has some just incredibly explosive plays. Imagine swinging in with once again honorary Fire Nation member Atali Primal Storm, only to get a spell from every player off of the attack trigger and then putting 4+1 counters on the entire board. That's grand. Norin the Wary, though, is my favorite in this deck, an absolute powerhouse here, triggering our commander every single turn by exiling itself and coming back into play, bestowing even more counters to our team every time. It is so dorky, and I love it so much. There are also several cards like Passionate Archaeologist to help us deal damage when casting things from exile. And additionally, it turns out that the average list also contains an infinite combo. Since Zuko will gain +1 counters, he can eventually get to a place where he firebends for 7+ mana at a time. And once we can do that, we are free to repeatedly activate Hellkite Charger to take extra combat steps, infinitely swinging in for damage until the entire table is taken out. With this in mind, an infinite combo that still takes a pretty decent degree of setup to actually work, as well as the Jeska's Will in the main list, this deck sits pretty comfortably in the bracket 3 space, and will upgrade accordingly. As far as the deck overall goes, the average deck seems to be blending a lot of the different archetypes Zuko could use, taking the best cards of each potential build path. We have Cascade, we have Blink synergies, and even some ways to preserve the firebending mana for later on the turn if we didn't use it during the actual combat. As a note, though, I think that this version of the deck kind of ends up being a bit of a weakness if Zuko gets removed from the field, as then all those various strategies in the 99 of the deck don't necessarily work well with each other. They just each individually work well with Zuko. That makes the deck very commander-centric, relying upon his presence on the field to tie everything together, and that can be a very big constraint with a lot of domino effects on the rest of the deck. For the most part, having the cream of the crop cards from each of those various possible archetypes still facilitates extremely powerful plays, but for our upgrade here, I would like to direct our swaps to help enhance some inter-deck synergy so that we are not trying to spin too many plates at once, and so that we do not always need Zuko in play for the entire deck to function, which means choosing one of these pathways to lean into more strongly than the others. So here's my hot take about this deck. I think leaning into Zuko's firebending ability is not the correct way to go here. Thematically, it makes sense to play with a ton of creatures from the Fire Nation and use a bunch of firebending there, but with a deck that has this many sorcery speed spells and with this commander that wants us to interact with a bunch of things from exile, that extra firebending package can get kind of cumbersome. If you're going for flavor, then, of course, by all means, lean into the firebending and lean into it hard. But this deck here doesn't strike me as an all-flavor deck the the way that the Aang deck did. So I don't feel that players here that are upgrading this list will prefer to stay to a thematic limitation. The goal of this series is about tuning up decks and becoming mechanically better brewers and better players. So to improve this deck, we do have to lean into what it is doing well and also acknowledge what it isn't doing well. Fire Lord Zuko decks that prioritize the firebending side of things end up having to rely a lot upon other cards in the deck that will be able to take advantage of that red mana. And frankly, I do think that the strong firebending theme, getting a bunch of red mana during combat, is something that Ozai decks are a lot better suited to than Zuko is. And irony of all ironies here, frankly, running all of those firebending cards ends up eating up so much room in this deck list, and we need that room for things like card advantage spells. The fewer card advantage spells that we have in the deck, the harder it is going to be for us to find any firebending payoff cards in the first place, right? To be honest, making this current version of an average Fire Lord Zuko deck try to focus more on firebending feels to me like it would sort of be putting the cart before the horse, or like it would lean too much into win more territory. For firebending payoffs to be meaningful, we need Zuko to be kind of big so that he's firebending for more mana. For Zuko to be kind of big, we need those +1 counters, and for those +1 counters that are increasing Zuko's size, we need to be playing stuff from exile. We need to respect that pathway. The firebending payoffs look really sweet, but we can't skip the importance of that first step in the game plan. Additionally, I've found that Fire Lord Zuko decks that are built more on the firebending side of things than the playing from exile side of things are also a lot more fragile. They're less resilient. If they encounter a setback, it is significantly harder for them to get the ball rolling again, because firebending is such a momentum-based press your advantage mechanic. Firebending is an exciting mechanic to play around, and Zuko can be a good place for that, but the current average list here feels to me like it's more suited to exile upgrades than to firebending upgrades. I think some of the other legends in this set are going to be a better fit for a dedicated firebending home, and that Zuko just applies himself a lot more consistently and a lot more impressively by leaning into his exile ability instead. By doing so, he gets a bigger army, and he gets more card advantage, and thus more options of things to play in the game, and he can recover from setbacks more easily when he has access to all of those options. He also just incidentally happens to get bigger, and thus will happen to make more mana on attack anyway. I think this is the most productive way to engage with Fire Lord Zuko. Treat his firebending like a cherry on top, not as the primary engine to try and build around. I think, really, to make Zuko come into his own, he just has to ditch the traditional expectations that have been set by his family. So with all that in mind, let's get swapping. Nahiri's Resolve is a must-have. End of our turn, exile our stuff, to then come back next turn with haste, and Zuko sees each one of them enter and gives the entire team +1 counters for each re-entry. This card makes our important creatures board wipe proof, leaving behind, say, tokens for blockers, and then everything will come back in a huge rush for bunches of damage. Amazing. So amazing that I'm also shaping some protection spells around this too. Eerie Interlude and Lae'zel's Acrobatics will join us here to dodge a board wipe and then come back in on the end step, with Zuko once again granting the entire team tons of +1 counters. That is what resiliency looks like. Then some +1 counter matters cards. Since all of our creatures are going to have +1 counters very regularly, we're putting in Damning Verdict as a one-sided board wipe that is going to hurt our opponents a lot more than it will hurt us. Additionally, I'm kind of stunned that Abzan Falconer isn't in the average deck already. Plop this down and suddenly the team has evasion? Gorgeous. And Felisa is even more protection. Go ahead, play a board wipe. We'll be left behind with a butt ton of Inkling tokens if you do. This is a great deterrent for enemy removal, which we kind of need because a lot of our impulse draw engines are attached to creatures that we want to make sure can stay in play for as long as possible. Speaking of which, for some more exile engines and payoffs, I love Laughing Jasper Flint, Araxa, and Opera Love Song. Jasper digs through other people's decks, not just ours, but it's still a really cheap card and a great form of exile card advantage. Meanwhile, Araxa builds out the army to give us even more tokens to pump up, and Opera Love Song as an instant is a very flexible spell that we'll appreciate the timing of a whole lot, whether we play it during combat or on someone else's end step. Okay, removal. To help with the exiling theme, we're adding Parting Gust and Abstruse Appropriation. Parting Gust can either exile something permanently or save one of our creatures, which Zuko will then buff the team for, and Abstruse Appropriation nukes an enemy card, which wouldn't normally be worth it for 4 mana, but the potential to then cast their thing later and to buff our army when we do so is pretty gnarly. And one last one, Heliod's intervention is great in general. I have this in a bunch of decks and I love its crushing flexibility, but if we happen to be in a good spot and Zuko can make a decent chunk of mana, it's a pretty fantastic instant to cast mid-combat too. Even just firebending for like 3 mana will mean that we can tap just 2 lands and kill off like 3 other things. You just can't beat a rate like that. Rounding out the inclusions, we are adding in 3 MDFC lands to improve our land count and our removal at the same time. The 3 that we're adding are Blood-Soaked Insight, Witch Enchanter, and Sundering Eruption. This puts our possible land total from 34 up to 37, thank goodness. Zuko makes mana, but we need consistent resources to play all the other stuff that doesn't just happen during combat. So this makes me feel a whole lot better about the deck. Oh, and I'm also going to swap a Plains for Windbrisk Heights, since that could give us another mid-combat trigger from exile, the Temperamental Firebending Temple for a Lindblom, which is an instant that we could cast during combat, and a permanent that will enter from exile, and a basic land for a Path of Ancestry, since that gives us the same color fixing as a Nomad's Outpost, but with occasional bonus scry. And finally, another basic for a Bojuka Bog, because. Alright, now to the cards that we're cutting. First, Wild Wasteland is cute, but not as good as our other options. 2 cards is nice, but it's not worth losing our draw step over, especially when we have other impulse draw engines that will even be able to wear the counters that Zuko gives out, or ones that make tokens and reward us for each exile card that we manage to play. Also, Airbending Ascension is neat, but this isn't the deck for it, because it just takes a moment to get going, and I like the other Blink options that we added a lot better. Next, we're removing a big chunk of the Firebending package. Firebender Ascension, Firebending Student, and Sozin's Comet, all gone. This deck just is not very good at using all of that mana mid-combat. The last Agni Kai is flavorful, but a very tricky spell to make work right, and I think it's going to be better in other places rather than here. Ishin, Two Heavens is One, is very good with Firebending, as long as you have a place to put that red mana. Firebending for 10 or whatever sounds awesome, but it doesn't mean anything if we can't put it anywhere. And this starting deck only contains like 8-ish places for varying masses of firebending mana to meaningfully be used or stored. Remember what I mentioned up top, firebending is a cool mechanic, but for us with this starting list, I think we need to commit to one of the several build pathways that were in the original version of this deck, and we need to focus more on what this deck does well, which is buffing an army by casting stuff from exile. I think if you want to go all in on firebending with Firelord Zuko, that would be cool, but it requires a much bigger overhaul than what we can do here without radically changing the deck. The family leaves too. Firelord Ozai, Ozai Phoenix King, and even the mono-red Iroh. To be frank, I think these Ozai cards are a much more compelling place to try out a deck that has a ton of firebending synergies and that wants to emphasize the creation of mana during combat. Haste Magic and Blazing Crescendo are good Firebender cards too, and their synergy with Zuko's power effect is pretty cool, but I like our other draw options that dig deeper a whole lot better, especially since those ones will help us even when we're behind. And again, there were not a ton of places for us to meaningfully use our red mana during combat consistently enough for these spell synergies with Zuko to always pay off and always being meaningful, compared to the consistent effectiveness of other cards that help us dig deeper for even more options. On that note, Firebending Turret, Mono Red Zuko, and Avatar Roku, I came real close to wanting to keep because they are useful places to put mana, it's true. But I just found when playtesting this deck that other things like the blink spells or things that dig for multiple cards that we could then cast and permanently buff the whole team when we cast them was just fun and more consistent than trying to get these cards to work to their fullest potential. Relying on them too much here feels like we're expecting for Zuko to always have good attacks, which is a tough thing to guarantee. After these swaps, we have a better land count, more opportunities to interact with our opponents or get some blockers out of our way, and we have a much more simplified game plan. This may not be the direction for every Zuko player, but I do think that this emphasis on Blink and on Exile really makes a Zuko deck come into its own. He doesn't need to try and mimic what the rest of his family can do. He can go his own way, and we should be proud of him for that. Before wrapping up, this episode could not have happened without the tremendous effort from writer Levi Perry. I've been doing all the writing and all the editing on the channel on my own for years now, so it's really wonderful to get to work with someone. So you can read Levi's articles on EDH Rec or check out his show, which is called The Thought Vessel on YouTube, to see even more of his great work. Thank you a bunch, Levi. Those are the decks that we have for you today. 5 decks and their upgrades, all of course linked in the description box below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider again if you would like to support us, either with the free YouTube thingies or the cool Patreon thingies. But regardless, I hope you had a good time with the upgrades for this deck, and that they will bring you joy during your next game night when you start playing with Avatar and Commander. I also hope you've enjoyed this new spin on upping the average. I know some folks have asked whatever happened to this series, and the truth is of course that it just gets hard to keep up with. A single video analyzing a single commander deck just isn't what it used to be when there are so many sets and so many amazing legends coming out all the time. My hope is that this approach will help the Upping the Average series adapt in a way that I can keep up with, and most importantly, adapt in a way that is the most useful to you. Which of these decks is your favorite? Are you building one of these commanders or maybe a completely different commander from this set? What other upgrades or swaps would you recommend to your fellow players? Let me know in the comments below, and as always, remember, EDH wreck your deck before you wreck your deck.